Okay, so good morning. As was said, my name is Gavan Patrick Gray, and I'm a professor at Tsuda University's College of Policy Studies in Tokyo, in Japan. Today, I want to talk a little bit about how a recent survey of Japanese female students reflects upon some of the problems faced by women in Japan, and what we can take from that in regard to how these issues should be addressed. When I use the title of today's presentation, A Threat to Mental and Physical Health, I don't just mean threats of violence, but rather the negative influences that can destroy happiness, motivation, and the sense of security that we all need to live a fulfilling and healthy life. To properly explain the dynamics of Japan's gender norms would take a few hours, so I'll be brief. Japan currently ranks 104 out of 190 countries for gender equality. As the world's third largest economy, this is pretty astounding. More surprising is that its ranking is actually dropping. While poorer countries have begun to improve their standing, Japan's comparative ranking seems to slip a little every year. And the reasons for this lack of development are complex, but we can see three factors here. In the 19th century, the country's strongly embraced nationalism saw men and women dedicate their lives to building a strong state. And this concept of self-sacrifice for the greater good is still very common in Japanese society. Japan also has a very vertical society, and age-based seniority and respect for elders and traditional paths of life is deeply ingrained. Finally, for more than a century, the most admirable role for women has been presented as that of a housewife who focuses on children's education. To say Japan's entirely patriarchal would be a bit too simplistic. Women wield considerable power within the family, including over family finances, but the gender roles are rigid and deep. And it's been especially difficult to break these in the spheres of politics and business. In other words, it's far more the conservative attitudes and adherence to outdated normative structures, more than misogynistic factors that contribute to the ongoing gender imbalance. Currently, the ratio of female parliamentarians is just over 9%, and that of female CEOs is just over 8%. Figures like this might make you think Japan is a terrible place for women to live. However, the reality is Japan is one of, if not the safest places in the world. Now, some might see this as a gilded cage for women in some way, living a comfortable life with limited opportunities for developing a career or influencing society. But it is nonetheless generally very safe. Unless, of course, you fall outside the system. And my talk today was inspired by a recent comment from a member of Japan's ruling government party, the LDP. This politician in the past claimed that there is no discrimination against women in Japan. Understandably, the politician was criticized for this obvious falsehood, but despite this, they doubled down and instead claimed, what I meant to say was, there's no discrimination against women in Japan that's life-threatening. Now, perhaps I have a different understanding to this politician regarding what a threat to life means. For me, it's not simply the things that result directly in death, but also the things that degrade people's lives so much that they see no value in it, or where the stress of such problems can lead someone to take their own life. In this form, Japan has many ongoing issues that represent threats to women's well-being and ultimately the fundamental quality of their lives. In order to gain a better understanding of the precise nature of those issues, I conducted a survey of female undergraduate students with just over 100 participants. The first thing I wanted to examine was their perspectives on the problems they saw as a threat to their current or future well-being. There are many options included, and they could choose as many as they wished, rating them on a sliding scale of severity. The results highlighted several issues as particularly worrying. The highest were depression, economic exploitation, gendered harassment, sexual molestation, and stalking. I know from experience some of these are quite widespread. However, some, such as stalking, were, despite the severity of the problem, much less common. Looking instead at the actual incidence of problems, I asked which issues had actually affected either the students or women close to them. In this case, the results showed slightly different patterns. Depression, harassment, and molestation remained high, but bullying, domestic violence, and sexual violence were notably higher than the previous results might have led us to expect. It would take time to explore this fully, but suffice to say, the first three groups, which scored high in both questions, receive a significant amount of public attention, with efforts being made to reduce their impact. The latter three, which did not score as high on the perception of threat, receive relatively little public attention, and in many cases, victims often decline even to report the problems, or those reports are brushed under the carpet by authorities. In short, even those affected by the most serious of problems are sometimes unaware of how widespread that threat is in society. Victims often think they're isolated, unique cases, and they fail to realize how many others share their experience. Looking at these common problems more broadly, I classify them into four main categories: the objectification and sexualization of women, domestic and sexual violence, hostile work environments, and mental and emotional health concerns. Before giving any further analysis, I'd like to share some basic information on the nature of these problems in Japan. Japan's sex industry is one of the world's largest. It employs roughly 300,000 women and is worth about $25 billion annually, making it larger than Japan's cosmetics and movie industries combined. Obviously, there's a wide variety of problems tied to this industry, but one is related to the sexualization of young women. Japan's focus on youth is not, as the West often thinks, a sign of widespread pedophilia. Instead, it's more of a Peter Pan complex driven by living in an incredibly rigid and stressful society. However, the harm on young people is the same. A focus on schoolgirls, teen idols, maid cafes, and sexualized comics have made young women and girls the target of sexual attention. Sexual violence in Japan, due to its low overall crime level, is not perhaps as widespread as in some Western countries, but it's hard to know the true extent. Surveys estimate 9% of women in Japan have survived sexual assault. However, incidents are reported in only 10% of cases. Intimate partner and domestic violence is different in that the level of reporting has been increasing year by year. At the moment, roughly 82,000 cases are reported to the police annually, but we know this is just a fraction of the overall incidence rate. Because of the nature of Japanese culture, stalking might have an especially high incidence rate compared to the West. Each year, there's roughly 23,000 cases, and 84% of the victims are female. Another problem that disproportionately affects young women is online harassment and abuse. During both junior and senior high school, twice as many young girls in Japan are affected by the problem as boys. Similar problems continue in women's working lives, where 28% of women in Japan experience gender-based harassment in the workplace. However, more than 48% of women never tell anyone about it, and only 10% report matters through official channels. Outside of work, the burden on women can often be far higher. There's now more than 1.5 million single-parent families in Japan, and 88% of them are single mothers. A key social issue at the moment in Japan is the shortfall in childcare services, and this affects this group of women especially severely. Turning to mental health, men in Japan generally have far higher incidence of suicide than women, yet during the COVID lockdown, the incidence rate for men climbed only slightly, but it nearly doubled for women. The consensus view is that the lockdown policies and social changes had a much more severe effect on women's emotional health than it did on men. Generally in Japan, women experience far higher rates of depression than men, a pattern that actually gets more severe with age. And trauma and long-term PTSD also affect Japanese women at a much higher rate, roughly twice that of men. In a survey of 30,000 victims of sexual abuse in Japan, 54% displayed clear symptoms of PTSD. However, only 3% had been medically diagnosed with the condition. In other words, a huge amount of Japanese women might suffer from PTSD without anyone ever recognizing the severity of their problem. So there's a wide variety of issues in Japan that present very real threats to the well-being and ultimately the lives of women. How do we begin to address them? I asked the student group further questions regarding the level of support they or those close to them have received from different groups in regard to their problems. First, I asked which groups they'd sought support from, leaving out their friends. Of course, this varied by the issue in question, but generally family was the highest, followed by teachers, doctors and therapists, specialist NGOs, and then legal services. However, almost half never sought any assistance. One reason for this is there's often serious hesitancy among women in Japan about reporting problems. We can see here the amount who report and then do not report various crimes to the police. The key reasons for this are a combination of social shame, a distrust of the effectiveness of authorities to provide assistance, and a feeling that authorities lack empathy for the person in need. I then asked the students how useful or effective the support they received was. In the case of NGOs, they were the most supportive, followed by family, and then predictably, medical professionals, teachers, and especially the police showed highly negative responses. I then asked an open-ended question on what form of negative response they encountered. Answers included a lack of understanding of women's issues, a feeling that they were very cold and impersonal in their treatment of the woman, a feeling of being looked down upon, a feeling of being blamed for the problem, or a feeling of a lack of concern or care on the part of the authorities. This is perhaps the heart of the problem facing many women in Japan. Just as the top political and corporate positions are almost entirely male, men also occupy a disproportionate number of top positions in schools, medical institutions, the police, and other organizations that women and young girls need to turn to for assistance. With men in those positions, it not only makes women hesitant to seek support, but it dramatically skews the type of support that's offered. To give an example regarding the response to sexual assault, in Ireland, my own country, we have a sexual assault response centre known as the Rowan. It was designed entirely with the needs of survivors in mind and is situated in a peaceful wooded area. Its interior is bright, warm and soft. Its staff are entirely female, and you're guided by people with training in gender violence and trauma response. In contrast, in Japan, this is the Tokyo Prosecutor's Office. It's a massive cold gray building, and survivors of sexual assault have to visit this to give reports. I've accompanied students to this building, and it looks even more severe at nighttime. I've had students physically collapse when approaching it simply because it felt so oppressive. Inside's no better, with bare, cold corridors devoid of any feeling. And finally, you have to sit down to be interviewed by a man, as almost all senior staff will be male, who will guide you in a slightly robotic way through a pile of bureaucratic red tape and countless documents that need to be filled in. The experience is awful, and it's not because the person on the other side doesn't care. Some of the staff really want to help the women they meet. The problem is that they're following a system designed by people with no understanding of the needs of women in these situations. Taking another example, support for sex workers. This is a night bus run by a group called Kalabo. They travel around Tokyo and provide direct support to young women, including high school girls, who work in the sex industry. Generally, the girls they work with are ones who've experienced violence, exploitation, or abuse of some kind. This year, they were visited by a group of politicians. The visitors were all men, and I can't say whether they sincerely wanted to help or if it was just a photo opportunity. But after the visit, the NGO made a formal protest to the government that the politicians had terrified the girls by suddenly shouting orders to their assistants, and some of the politicians had been constantly touching or trying to hug the girls who didn't want any physical contact. Now, the knee-jerk response might be to label the politicians as creeps or worse. However, it's possible they actually sincerely wanted to help, but were just absolutely idiotic in the way they approached it. Again, high-level positions in Japan are utterly out of touch with the needs of vulnerable women. For real change to occur, more young women need to be moving into positions of organizational authority. To examine this aspect, I asked some further questions of the survey group. Firstly, how important is it that new policies be created to address women's issues? Of course, there was almost universal strong support, with just a few perhaps thinking society's not that bad. Next, I asked, how important is it that more women be included in the political process? Here you might be surprised that the results are less strong, but you have Japan's gender norms at play, and some students genuinely believe in meritocracy, so they might just want the best person to be selected regardless of gender. Next, we asked, how important is it that younger people be included? And here we can see Japan's vertical society at play. Often young people expect their elders to take charge and make decisions, but still there's very much broad support for major changes to occur. So we moved on to asking students, how much do you follow political news? And here we begin to see some of the problem. Most students, even those studying policymaking and who care about specific issues, don't pay much attention to the wider political picture. And then the final question, how much do you yourself participate in political activities or action? And the level of involvement here was even lower. Speaking to individual students, I know many are very active in volunteer or NGO activities, but generally these focus on direct support for social problems rather than more political lobbying or activism. This narrow focus on small, localized, short-term change without linking it to broader and deeper long-term change can be a serious problem. In other words, they are socially active, but they have short-term goals in mind, rather than being more politically active with long-term, deeper goals in mind. Japan is changing. That's something that's very clear. New laws on sexual violence and the promotion of equality have been introduced almost annually in recent years. Yet the problems of violence and inequality are not seeing a dramatic reduction. So my message today is that it's not a bad thing to identify problems faced by women in society, obviously, and it's certainly not a bad thing to bring in laws to address those issues. However, unless we have women in positions of authority to implement those laws, they will not be carried out in a way that properly understands and supports the needs of vulnerable women. This is why I believe that political apathy among younger women, and again, this is a different thing from an interest in social issue, can be so dangerous for the long-term promotion and protection of women's rights at a deep and broad organizational level. And hopefully we can all play a part in encouraging the students, the young students that we know, to become more politically active and to focus on this deeper, higher level political change as well. Thank you for listening.